Welcome to Movie Caps. Today I will show you a drama, crime, biography film from 2019 titled Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. Liz sits down in a bleak room on one side of a pane of glass, a telephone to her left. She is in a prison, visiting Ted, her former lover, and he is brought in on the other side by a guard. His handcuffs are taken off and he sits down to talk to Liz. She asks Ted if he remembers the first night they met. Several years prior, Liz is sitting at a bar with her friend Joanna. Liz admonishes Joe for picking out a college bar, and she says that as a single mother she feels she doesn't fit in. Joe turns her attention to the man, Ted, sitting in a small distance away, looking at her and smiling. They flirt by the jukebox and slow dance at the bar. Ted eventually drives her home. As they reach the door, Liz's babysitter exits in a hurry, saying she needs to get home. After she's gone, Liz tells Ted she understands if he doesn't want to come inside because of the baby. He says he doesn't care. They check on Molly, the child, and go to bed. The next morning Liz wakes in her bed alone and notices that Molly is not in her crib. She panics and rushes out into the kitchen to find Ted making breakfast for them, Molly seated neatly in her high chair. The trio spends the next several years together, celebrating birthdays and holidays as Molly grows older. There's a news broadcast of the discovery of several dead and missing women, the suspect being a man who pretends he's injured and asks women for help loading things into his car. Ted drives down the street in the middle of the night when he is pulled over by a police officer. He gets out of the car and tries to charm the officer, telling him that he's a law student in Utah just trying to get back home to his girlfriend. The cop is not swayed, and arrests Ted for running several stop signs. While he is in custody, a woman who was recently assaulted picks him out of a lineup. The police also search his car and find several pieces of suspicious equipment. He is given a court date. He returns home to Liz to find her very upset with him. His pictures are all over the papers and she's angry that he hasn't told her what's going on. They go to dinner with Molly that night and Ted attempts to explain everything away. He tells her that his photo was given to the girl accusing him prior to the lineup, and that his name has been given to the police. He suspects that he's being set up. Ted points out the window of the diner at a car parked on the street and tells Liz that the car has been following him ever since he got back to town. He tells Liz that he's going to be up late that night at the library trying to prepare for his case. While he's gone, Liz gingerly goes through his suitcase. Once at the library, a girl studying near him recognizes Ted from the pictures in the newspapers and alerts security personnel. He is kicked out of the library and sees the same suspicious car parked outside. As he tries to confront the driver, the car speeds off, and he is forced to try to finish studying at home. Liz accompanies him in court and listens to the woman testify against him. Ted's lawyer cross-examines her and renders the majority of her testimony worthless, since he proves that the police gave her too much information and appeared to coach her. Ted and Liz visit an animal shelter to pick out a dog. While they're there they run into one of Ted's former colleagues, Carol, who flirts brazenly with Ted in front of Liz, making her jealous. She tells Ted that she knows he didn't commit any of the crimes he's being accused of and that she supports him no matter what. After saying goodbye to Carol, Liz and Ted visit with some of the dogs, but they don't seem to like him, barking and growling at him. They return home and drink, fantasizing about their future together and having an intimate moment. The next court appearance Liz accompanies him to, Ted is taken into custody. He arrives at the prison and empties his pockets and is forced to change into prison garb. Ted calls Liz on the phone shortly afterwards and assures her that everything is going to be okay. It's all just been a misunderstanding. Liz tells him that she wants to come visit him. Detectives contact Liz while she is at work and informs her that Ted is also under suspicion for crimes committed in Colorado. This upsets her greatly and she tells the detective not to contact her at work anymore and hangs up. Ted studies his case file in prison, trying to prepare for upcoming appearances in court. He is approached by a detective who asks him a few questions about his presence in Colorado and Ted is defensive. He tells the detective that he's never even been to Colorado. Later, Ted is confronted by his lawyer about the interaction. The detective caught him in a lie. Ted had been to Colorado and the detective had his gas slips as proof. Detectives from surrounding states have taken interest in Ted's case and they're examining all of their open cases and comparing them to his own. His lawyer tells him that he isn't licensed in Colorado and that Ted will have to find a new lawyer. Ted is taken to the county jail in Colorado. Liz has drinks with her friend Joe back at her house and they discuss Ted's situation. Shortly into the conversation it becomes clear that Joe is not convinced that Ted is innocent. Liz is offended and kicks Joe out, then goes and cries by herself in the shower. Ted calls Liz at work the next day and tells her that he's been approved to be co-counsel of his own case. He has his own office and unlimited access to the phone. She tells him she isn't in the mood to talk and hangs up on him. He calls back several times, and when he is able to keep her on the line, he tells her about a book he's been reading. It's about a man that is wrongfully accused of a crime and has to undergo all sorts of challenging trials, but throughout the whole ordeal he never loses hope. Liz tells him to call her back that night at home. During his pre-trial, Ted is taken back to prison without bail. The opposing side makes it clear that they will be going for the death penalty. Ted calls Liz from jail and tells her what happened. He is shocked and hurt to learn that Liz will not be coming to the trial. She hangs up on him. While in prison, Ted is interviewed by reporters about what it's like to be an innocent man locked away in prison with no one to believe him. He hams it up for the camera and tries to gain public sympathy, maintaining his claim of innocence. Liz watches the interview somberly at home. Officers get him ready for the trial. Shortly after arriving, he asks if he can use the phone to call Liz when they're on recess. The cop on duty is interrupted from flirting with a woman who had come to watch the trial. He escorts Ted to the office where the phone is kept. Ted pretends to call Liz and talk with her on the phone. When the officer is convinced Ted isn't doing anything suspicious, he leaves him alone and returns to flirt with the woman. Once Ted is left alone, he sees his opportunity for escape. He climbs out the office window and jumps down into the courtyard, drawing attention from several nearby civilians. He rounds a few corners and changes clothes in an alley. One of the women who saw him jump from the window alerts police and tells them which direction he was headed. News reports air about Ted's escape, and Liz watches them on the television. Joe comes over to discuss Ted's situation again, and they speculate as to whether they think he will try to come back home to Liz or not. Joe tells Liz that she's been drinking too much and that she's torturing herself by not having let Ted go yet. She tells Liz that she's in denial and that she needs to move on. Ted is recaptured in the mountains and brought back to prison. Liz comes and visits him and tries to impart the severity of the situation to him. Now, in addition to all the other charges against him, he'll have to face even more consequences for escaping. Ted gives Liz the book he was describing to her in the courthouse and asks her if she's lost hope in him. She tells him that she can't do this anymore. Ted starts to panic and assures her that he can escape again and they can run away together and start a new life. Liz gives Ted a picture of a shark that Molly drew for him and leaves. While Ted hangs Molly's drawing above his bed in his cell, Liz removes his picture from a frame at her desk at work, puts it between the pages of the book Ted gave her, and shuts it away in her desk drawer. In the break room, one of her coworkers, Jerry, shyly flirts with her and makes conversation about lunch and the holidays. Ted writes Liz a letter telling her that he can live without her, and gets started on his next escape plan. He gets a job at the prison working with power tools and takes a piece of equipment with him back to his cell. While other inmates are showering, it's loud enough in his cell that he can saw at the ceiling without anyone noticing. He breaks through the hole he carved and climbs up into the ceiling. Liz watches the news report about Ted's escape, and a detective knocks on her door. He lets her know that if she doesn't tell him if Ted tries to contact her, that she will be in a lot of trouble. He hands her an envelope with Ted's case file and leaves. A newly free man, Ted goes out drinking at college bars and flirts with several girls. Television reports the next day state that the girls had been killed, along with several others in dorms nearby. Ted is driving alone at night and is pulled over by a police officer. He panics, but quickly calms himself. He gets out of the car to confront the officer, and when he is asked to provide his license and registration, he fakes looking for his wallet and assaults the officer. He makes a run for it. While Joe, Liz, and Molly play cards, Liz takes a phone call from Ted. He informs her that he'd been caught again and that he's in Florida. Liz hangs up on him and returns to the game. After Ted is settled into his new cell, the local sheriff pays him a visit. He makes it clear that he has every intention of getting Ted convicted and tells him that he won't be able to play tricks on him. The sheriff calls in some of his colleagues to take photographs of Ted's teeth. The sheriff decides to read Ted's indictment in front of the press, but Ted sees it as an opportunity to try and garner some sympathy from the public. He tells the press about the poor treatment he is receiving in prison and that he hasn't been allowed to tell his side of the story. He accuses the sheriff of trying to use his case as a means of securing his re-election. He tears up the indictment in front of the cameras and is escorted away. He tries to call Liz several times, but she won't answer. Instead, he decides to call Carol, the woman he had seen when he was at the animal shelter with Liz. Carol comes to visit him in prison, and Ted tells her about the way he's being unjustly treated. She sympathizes with him and tells him she would be more than happy to move to Florida so that she can support him and try to help him win his case. Liz finally reads the book Ted had given her for Christmas. Jerry makes an unexpected visit, bringing her soup and explaining that he assumed she was sick because she had been missing so much work. She invites him inside. While Ted is having a visitation with Carol, Ted's new lawyer introduces himself. Ted makes it clear that he can share any details about the case in front of Carol. His lawyer tells him that his case will be the first televised trial in history, and that the court wants to make a deal. In exchange for his confession to the crimes, they will waive the death penalty and sentence him to life in prison instead. He violently refuses and sends the lawyers away. Carol is distraught and offers to help him get his story out. She admits to Ted that she was in Utah at the animal shelter specifically to see him. At Ted's trial, the seats are mostly filled with giggling young girls eager to get a look at Ted. Liz watches the trial from home. Carol is interviewed by the press and she relates several phrases that Ted had coached her to say to try and gain sympathy from the public. Ted tries to call Liz again one night, but she is asleep on the couch with Jerry. Jerry gets up from the couch and unplugs the phone. Jerry is able to see that Liz is still in love with Ted by the way she watches the trials. Carol puts together an intervention for Ted, inviting his mother and lawyers to talk with him in his cell and beg him to accept the deal the court is offering. They don't want him to die. He concedes to thinking about it, and blows up at Carol for arranging the whole thing. He demands she never do anything like it again. Later in court, Ted is about to announce that he will take the plea deal, but instead takes the opportunity to admonish his lawyers in front of the whole court, accusing them of being incapable and not doing their job. He dismisses his lawyers and becomes lead counsel of his own case. He is very charismatic in court and successful in winning over the public. Ted calls Liz the next day, but Jerry picks up instead. Jerry tells Ted that he can't call Liz anymore. Ted asks Jerry to tell Liz one last thing from him, that he loves her. This makes Jerry very angry and he hangs up the phone. Liz has a montage of flashbacks from her time with Ted, reliving all of the moments she felt the most in love with him. Ted pays a guard to let him have a moment with Carol in the prison hallway behind a vending machine. After they finish, Carol notices there's something off about him and she accuses him of still being in love with Liz. Ted assures her that he isn't and tells her that they should get married. He fills her ears with daydreams about a future together. Ted calls Carol as a witness in court, and while he has her on the stand he proposes to her. She accepts, and Ted informs the audience that in the state of Florida, a couple is legally married if they say vows in a court in front of a judge. Liz and Jerry watch this display on the news. Liz confronts Jerry about unplugging the phones at night and not telling her when Ted called. He promises her that he's only doing what he thinks will help her get over him. She's in denial and needs to let Ted go. Liz tries to kick Jerry out of the house, but he is able to calm her down. Liz admits the reason she feels so guilty about Ted's situation is because she's the one that gave Ted's name to the police when the first few girls started going missing. Jerry reassures her that she's done the right thing and that she shouldn't feel guilty for the consequences of Ted's own actions. After both Ted and the state prosecutor give their closing statements in court, Ted is interviewed in his cell with Carol. He is called back to the court to hear the jury's verdict, but Carol has him stay behind for a few moments so she can tell him something important. Carol tells Ted that she is pregnant with his child. Ted is found guilty of all charges and given the death penalty. He tries to make one last appeal to the judge but is shot down and taken back to prison. Liz and Jerry watch the verdict with relief. Liz throws away all of her alcohol. Later, after Liz has been promoted at work, she is interrupted interviewing a new employee with the delivery of a letter. She dismisses the girl to read the letter in private. It's a letter from Ted trying to assure her that everything will be fine. He says that he will plead guilty to buy himself a little more time. Liz goes to visit Ted the day before he is executed. She begs him to tell her the truth, to admit to what he's done so that she can get some closure. She tells him that he's been torturing her with this for years and she deserves to know the truth. Ted tries to deny any guilt, but eventually admits what he's done to Liz. Liz leaves the room, incredibly upset, and a detective replaces her in the chair to interview Ted. Liz leaves the prison and returns to Molly and Jerry waiting for her in the car. The end. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this.